to Maxed Out Man, helping you become the man you were made to be.
Hey guys, it's Kevin Davis from the Maxed Out Man podcast. This is episode 57. I'm going to be here with Jindy Mann. And hey, before I forget, don't forget to check us out on maxedoutman.com and go to all our socials. We're pretty much everywhere, so check for Maxed Out Man. Jindy's a certified leadership coach, organizational consultant, and men's work facilitator with 20 years experience working in large organizations and startups across the multiple sectors. Through his coaching practice, The Selfish Leader, he takes a person-centered approach to deepen self-awareness and understanding. He's also the founder of Leader, Brother, Son, facilitating spaces for real and open conversations, which we all need, between men, exploring topics often left unspoken and relating to each other in ways that men may not be able to do elsewhere. Leader, Brother, Son run free men's circles, host an online community, and work with organizations to give talks and workshops and run groups. Hey, that's awesome information. I know you and I, before we got started, so we've got coaching, organizational work. We want to talk about men and masculinity and connection and all that. So, hey, welcome. Thanks for coming. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be here. Excited to see how this conversation unfolds.
Yeah, it's always fun, these conversations, to get to know people. And I always say I would never have, this is a conversation that you and I would never have. You actually pointed out that until like an hour ago, you had never heard of Bozeman, Montana. So chances are that we would not run into each other on the street. But hey, fill us in. I know you're a little bit unsure, like kind of where this topic would go and what exactly we talk about. So I know that there's some gaps from that bio that I gave. So feel free to fill it in. Take as long as time as you want. It all started back in 19 whatever, but yeah, just fill me in and let's get started.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the introduction. And maybe I'll add a bit of texture to the story. And so I'll go a little bit further back, maybe, and we could go right back to the start. But I'll just go back to where when I went to university. I did two business degrees almost by accident. What I actually wanted to study was journalism or advertising, and was kind of persuaded out of it by family for various reasons, and then kind of ended up going into the corporate world, and then ended up in consulting, and my career kind of continued from there. And but maybe about 6 or 7 years into that, realized I was good at what I did, but I didn't really enjoy it and felt completely lost. And then started to really think about what I did want to do. And I started working with a coach, and that was about 16 years ago. And that actually took me on a path that took me in lots of different directions. I thought I was going to be working on what's my next career move, but that's always the tip of the iceberg. What I was really figuring out was all sorts of stuff about who am I, what am I here to do, what's my mission, and that's brought me to the things you've described in the introduction that I'm doing now. And interestingly, I reflect back at the young guy who wanted to be a journalist, and I think that is some of what I'm doing now. Not just because I write a lot and publish stuff, but because what I'm motivated by is trying to figure out what's going on. And whether that's in coaching or in consulting or in the work I'm doing with men, it's my kind of central inquiry is what's really going on here. And that I think is kind of a journalistic attitude. So I guess in some ways I've kind of come back to being a journalist.
Yeah, so it's almost like investigative journalism. And you mean what's going on inside each person in society and community? How does that kind of walk itself out?
Yeah, kind of all of those things really. It's so if we just take coaching, for example, and being with an individual might come with a particular thing they want to work through. They've been promoted to a senior leadership position, or they want to grow their business, or they want to exit their business. And that's always just the starting point. It's then always there's always much more beneath the surface, and that's my curiosity. It's okay, well, why do you want to do this? And what's taking you to this point? What are you looking for next? And kind of just exploring and seeing where that goes. Very much like this conversation, really. It's kind of let's see where this goes, but always with the underlying um, desire or intention to surface what might be really going on. Because that's where the answers really lie.
Yeah, I think it's kind of crazy because if you're journalistic and then also with advertising and marketing, This is a kind of a strange comparison, but you can almost compare those things. I had a friend of mine that had a psychology degree, and he was amazing at sales. He was amazing at product development because at the end of the day, the idea is to get to know the customer, quote unquote, and then to expose their pains and expose how you can address those pains, which is actually very similar to what we do as coaches, right?
Mm. Absolutely, yeah. I've got a book just here actually on my shelf. I'll just show it to you actually, 'cause it's right next to me. There's a guy called Rory Sutherland who runs a big advertising agency, and it's a global one, but it's based in the UK. And his that book and his whole thinking is about the psychology of decision making. It's about the psychology of consumers and about how you craft messages and communicate to people using principles of psychology. So, his kind of lens is advertising, but really he's talking about how do we understand people? Because if you want to be a good advertiser or brand marketer or anything in that space, you're really talking about understanding people and what motivates people.
Yeah. And how do you use that within your own coaching, given your background and all of that? Like, how do you use that? Because you're doing individual coaching, you're doing major, kind of doing organizational work. What's kind of your process for using that in the back end, and kind of how do you approach? Because each coach, each person that deals with people kind of has a different approach in order how to do that.
Mm. Yeah, I don't have a methodology or a process because um as I've kind of alluded to, for me, my the way I work with people and organizations is very fluid. So there can be a starting point and a kind of framework or structure just to kind of anchor the conversation or the engagement. But what happens within it is really fluid because organizations are made up of humans. Humans themselves are complex. We're complex and ultimately unknowable beings. So we're always kind of building hypotheses as we go along, going, it might be this, it might be that, and just seeing what comes out of those conversations. So I don't have a strict process, but I guess my philosophy, if we can call it that, is to start with the person and to help the person to begin to develop more self-awareness, because the more they understand themselves, the more they're going to understand how they make decisions, why they're making decisions, why they have a particular ambition or a goal, what might be getting in their way, and that can go in any direction. At, at some point, and maybe at some point we'll talk about kind of therapy and coaching and how they're different and how they also overlap. I never position myself as a therapist because I see that as a very protected profession and requires certain qualifications. And yeah, in my leadership coaching work, at some point, without me asking, an individual will talk about their childhood and their parents.
Mm.
Always. There has to be a willingness to be able to work with that and try and join the dots of, well, how's that relevant to what you want to do now, and how might that be influencing what you want to do now and have influenced your journey so far. So it is kind of journalistic, I guess, the approach that I take.
Yeah, and in journalism, you basically start with kind of this idea of what you think a particular story is going to be, but then essentially you follow, they call it following the lead, right? Like it's you follow where the story takes you in a journey, because you may have a conversation with one person, you may come up with a fact from one thing, you may
Mm,
see, okay, this is a particular path, and that's really, yeah, that's so my wife's degree, she was a journalism major, ended up writing and all that. And I love investigative journalism, and it's a little sad because it doesn't exist kind of in the same way that it did when you and I were growing up.
mm,
Now it's more journal and entertainment. It's all entertainment, right? So it doesn't really
mm,
have that. I think are a bit are the people that are calling themselves actual journalists now that do the work that we think of as journalism, they're
yeah.
few and far between now. But I think that's really cool that process would continue to be on a micro and macro level, micro man, with the person, and then macro when you're dealing with organizations, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I like this macro framing because we can think about it at an individual level, organization, but then we can also go society and world and what's going on. And because those things can be more related than we realize, and they are. There is always a relationship between those different contexts. Also, you mentioned story, and I think that's really important because we all have a story about our lives. You asked me to introduce myself. You gave me an intro, then I added some context to it, and I could talk for another couple of hours and give you some version of a story. You could tell me your story. We all have a story. We live by a story of the person we've become. We can tell a story about that. And then we have a story about who we are now and therefore, what we're going to do next. So I think any development work with a human is about helping them understand what stories they're carrying and actually what stories they want to live going forward. We're constantly formulating stories, and that's kind of what journalism does. You're trying to get to the root source of some facts, but you're never going to have all the facts. So you build a certain set of facts and then you create a story around those facts. And that's the way a journalistic story makes sense. It has to be a narrative. And the same is true for us. We're not a collection of data points as human beings. We're a story. So a lot of the work is around stories. It's true in organizations as well. Organizations tell themselves a story. A brand is a story. A country is a story. It
Mhm.
doesn't exist unless it has a narrative and a mythology. So um, I think that's a nice way to frame it.
Yeah, I didn't plan on this, but I'll take this analogy a little bit further, which is we just said that today's journalism, I'll put that in quotes, is all about entertainment, and you use the word narrative, right? And that has such a negative connotation now. But essentially, you take a very small amount of fact, you rewrap it in the way that you think people need to hear it or want to hear it to make them believe a certain thing about that particular story. It seems like to me, and you can, feel free to expound on this, but that's especially as men, but I think all people, that's what we do, right? Like we rewrite, embellish, change that our internal story to fit kind of this, not, some in societal, some it's our own, our own issues, but to rewrite that narrative in order to fit what we think it should say.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree with that. And gender is a story. Gender's a form of identity, and identity is something we kind of form unconsciously, mostly. And so when I think about what does it mean to be a man, a question we often explore in our groups, or what does masculinity mean? What we really the answers we might have already are really stories. They're like stories about what the role of man means, and that is really rich and complex and varied, and it goes back to kind of mythology. And there's so much in ancient mythology that actually still is true now about the way we think about gender and about men and about women. Is actually, if you look at ancient mythology, some of it's still true today. Religion plays a part, biology plays a part. There's so many things that play a part, but I think that's an interesting angle that we are living a story when it comes to being a man. We're living a role, really.
Yeah, that's, I had a guest on last week or week before last, and we were talking about he uses story from an adventure standpoint in order to help men kind of figure out where their identity lies and all that. But he
Mm,
has them kind of create characters. And in the marketing world, we call it avatar. We
mm.
want to create that ideal customer avatar so we can understand that person. But he uses it kind of in his coaching practice in order to help them walk through that. Can you dig in? Because I'm not particularly well versed on mythology. Can you dig into that a little bit? What you just said about kind of this, ideology and how everything works and kind of how we define ourselves, and I'd be particularly interested where that shifts. Like, is that based on human nature? Because, we have thousands of years of human nature and behavior and those kind of things. Um, that's kind of because I take a pretty conservative approach to all of that stuff, not necessarily whether I'm right or someone else is wrong, but in my own ideology and belief system, that tends to be relatively, traditional, I guess you would say. But I'm interested kind of in that background that you just described.
Mm. Um, so maybe I'll I'll give one example, and it kind of might help to explain what my perspective is. I wrote a piece not long ago about the Prometheus myth, and Prometheus was this Titan in Greek mythology, and he's known as a figure, a mythological figure. He created humanity because he stole fire from the gods. He stole fire from Zeus and gave the power of fire as well as many other gifts to human beings. And for that, he was punished. He was punished for the rest of his life. So, and there's so many aspects to that story because well, I'll give kind of two aspects to it. There's one that he was punished by Zeus, so there was this kind of betrayal aspect to this masculine betrayal, and so Zeus used his power to punish this person who betrayed him, even though Prometheus is largely regarded as a kind of noble figure who was kind of saying, oh, you know, humans deserve to have these skills, these gifts, these qualities. I want to give them. Uh, Elsewhere in the myth is Pandora appears. So the phrase Pandora's box. Zeus sends Pandora to Earth to Prometheus's brother, who's a less wise character. He's a bit of a foolish character, to deceive Prometheus's brother. And Pandora's been given this box full of things, and she's told not to open the box. So, and what we see in the myth is that her curiosity gets the better of her. And so she
Mm.
opens the box, and all of the world's evils and bad things fly out. And so, in that, we can see how how women begin to be positioned in mythology. So Pandora was considered like a punishment to be sent to men because women didn't exist until Pandora was sent in this particular myth. And also, she was told not to open the box, but she disobeyed because of her innate curiosity. So you can kind of see what the Greeks at least had. They had some ideas about, you know, men and women and the difference between them. And then when we take Prometheus as a figure, I mean, there's two films that spring to mind because I love connecting it to modern day.
Mm.
That's Prometheus the film, which is the in the Alien universe, and Prometheus is kind of the concept of that film is that there's what were they referred to as
Mm.
engineers, I think, who had created humanity.
Oh yeah, I
But
remember
then
that one. Yep.
yeah, and but then the most recent one and the film that absolutely blew my mind is Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer is based on a book called American Prometheus, which is about it's a biography of Oppenheimer, and it's because Oppenheimer created this unbelievable atomic power, but was then punished afterwards, as we see in the film. You know,
Mm.
dragged through sort of Senate hearings and so on. So he's a kind of Promethean figure. So we see these we see these mythological roles and figures and aspects of them play out over and over again. We see them in patterns throughout history. Why that is, we can't say. You know, we can't say that there's something innate in biological or whether we're living these myths, but there is something interesting about when you go back and read these myths, you'll immediately connect with them and you immediately see figures that throughout history, but also in the present day that you can see again and again and again. One I often use is James Bond. You know,
Mm.
James Bond is considered this very masculine sort of figure, but he's quite a tragic figure as a mythological figure. Um, Once you get beneath the surface of, you know, the fast cars and the gadgets and the clothes and, you know, sleeping with lots of women, would any man really want to be him? You know, he's got
Mm.
no friends, he's got no social life. He's
Anybody he hooks up with dies, right?
Anybody who hooks up with dies. He can't hold down a relationship. He's an alcoholic. You know, he's a pretty tragic figure once you get beneath the surface, and you see those sorts of figures in mythology quite often.
Yeah, I think, it's funny that you bring up Bond because I think as they got into the Daniel Craig era of Bond, I think we saw more of that part of
Mhm.
Bond's character. And honestly, truth be told, I've never actually read a Bond novel. So I wouldn't know if that's stuff that they, when they had Sean Connery and Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan and all of those Bonds, whether or not they just left that aspect out of that character. But I particularly enjoyed Daniel Craig as Bond primarily because of that more humanistic. I said this on another podcast, but basically anything that has irreverent humor, sort of stuff blows up, people get shot, and cars get driven, I'm in. Like, doesn't matter really what it is. It could be like the worst movie ever, but also to and to have that kind of that vulnerability that Daniel Craig is particularly good at in that character, I
Mm.
think is really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think his version of Bond really showed the kind of exposed the fallibility and vulnerability and the full extent of would you really want to be this guy? And I think most guys, I think, would say, actually, if I really look at it, not a life I'd choose. And it is I've read some of the novels and he's a much in the novels he's a much colder and more tragic figure. He's kind of a cold-blooded assassin, Bond, and as you said, a lot of that is left out of was left out of particularly like Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan. It was kind of left out of that. Timothy Dalton was quite close to it.
Mm-hmm.
Sean Connery was a little bit closer to it. And Daniel Craig is a kind of almost like a modernized version of it. I mean, particularly when you go back, I can't remember which film it is, where that Skyfall, where they go back to his childhood home, and you know, the original origin story of Bond is that he's an orphan,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a traumatized orphan who's never dealt with his childhood. So when you start to build in those things, he's a much more complex character, which I think is interesting from a masculine perspective.
And that's what made him a target for MI6, right? Like that's all right, this guy's got no
Exactly.
connections. We've trained him from however, I can't remember at what age they kind of got a hold of him, but we trained him to be this, to be how he is, but in his
Mm,
nature, you can't escape your own nature in
yeah.
that case. So I don't know how we got on the Bond, kind of soliloquy, but I think there's a new character, which is I'm really into Jack Reacher. I really like Jack Reacher's. I don't know if you've seen this on Amazon Prime, but it's just like 25 books also that
Mm,
have been written.
mm. I've seen the first film, I think, and I've read one of the books because a friend of mine was raving about it years ago, and I think I read the first book in the series, and and now that it's really interesting you talk about Jack Reacher because when I think about Jack Reacher and I think about the friend who recommended Jack Reacher and what really appealed to him and what I found interesting about the book as well was his self-sufficiency.
Hmm.
This is a guy who constantly solves problems and also lives in a similar way to Bond, lives a really minimalist lifestyle. He's constantly on the move. He's got no attachments. He's got like one t-shirt, that he washes.
Yeah, he just
And
he just buys he actually just buys new clothes and throws away whatever he was wearing. He always shops at
that's
at,
it.
thr- at thrift
Yeah.
stores, right?
Yeah. Is it Goodwill stores you call them in the
Yeah,
US?
yeah,
He goes,
Goodwill
yeah,
or
he goes to
thrift
Goodwill.
or yeah. What do they call them in the
Yeah.
UK?
Just like charity shops or
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
they'd be called like charity shops or secondhand shops. But yeah, so he's kind of uh, I guess there's a few things there. There's freedom, there's self-sufficiency, there's lack of attachment. So that appeals to, I think, another masculine archetype and one that I recognize in myself, and I think a lot of men have, but don't quite perhaps don't act on, and that's a good thing for in some ways, which is the hermit solo individual. Go and sort of be out there on my own, sort of looking after stuff, being self-sufficient. That's a very appealing archetype, I think. And the way that I think about it is that I indulge it every now and again in healthy ways. I do adventure travel, and I'll go and spend 24 hours solo, or I'll go and do a fast or something. Um, because I think that's important. It's important for me. I think it's if you feel a call to that, I think it's always worth getting back to uh, journalistic approaches, getting curious about what you're drawn to, what is it you need, and how can you incorporate that in your life without dropping all your commitments and relationships and going indulging your fantasy. Because those things exist in all of us. We all have fantasies about what we really want to be or have, and we have these deep desires. And I think healthy human development is not about repressing or ignoring those desires. It's about admitting they exist and then finding a way to either enact them safely or process them in some other way.
Yeah, and I think, I'd love to kind of know how many men that you deal with that actually have found kind of that balance. I personally am someone that I'm very content. I've been married for 28 years, been with my wife for 30. My kids are great. I live the life that I want. I've been self-employed for 25 years. I've got, the home I want. I travel, all of these things. Like I don't, maybe I'm lying to myself. We can delve into that a little bit if I am, but feel free to coach me and ask me questions along the way. But I wonder how many men are in that place. And I think that's one of the things that I feel like I can offer to other men is not, hey, you need to do these things, but
Mm.
these are the things that I've done and kind of how I get there. That being said, I'm 51, my wife's 50, and we're comfortable in our own mortality, and we kind of talk about those things. And I basically said, if you die, I've had the love of my life, right? Like
Mm.
I have no desire to remarry or anything like that. Like it's not even
Mm.
on the radar because maybe that's my secret hermit desire, right? Like okay, I'm done with that and I'll just kind of be with my friends and family and go. I joke and say I'll take the two wiener dogs, sausage dogs as you guys call them, which I have. I'll go live on a boat in the Caribbean and be, some tour guide or whatever. But
Yeah.
I'm interested to know your thoughts about all that and kind of how readily are we finding men that have, a really good sense of who they are and where they are in their own lives.
Yeah, I guess I mean, but by the way, you just articulated a beautiful fantasy. It's like, if you do end up on your own, then you'll go and live on this boat in the Caribbean with the dogs, and I mean, beautiful, right? And that's not to say you should go and enact that fantasy, but you're aware that that is what you do, and there is a part of you that would survive, or not just
Hmm.
survive, that would thrive. So,
Right.
um, hard to generalize, I guess, about men, but I can talk about the men that have been in our groups and what we kind of see in those groups. And I think one of the biggest things, our conversation groups, they run for 8 weeks and they're free and we do them online and we have guys from all over the world. And we always ask the group what they want to talk about. So as far as possible, it's the group deciding what they want to talk about. Every now and again, we might drop in a suggestion, but it's mostly the group deciding. And what we've seen over 3 years now of these groups is the same sort of themes reappear that guys want to talk about. So it's things like relationships, work, stress, money. Um, Sometimes they want to talk about masculinity and what it actually means to be a man. They want to actually explore that question. And actually, all of the things I mentioned are usually centered around that question, whether it's money or relationships or stress. It's kind of centered around and how am I experiencing those things as a man? So they're the kind of themes we talk about in our conversations. But over the course of these conversations, the kind of one of the threads throughout hosting these conversations is a sense of loneliness amongst men. I think there's a real desire for community, for connection with men in a way that's more intimate than a lot of guys get to experience male friendships. There's a lot of research coming out now, a lot of conversation now about male mental health and loneliness and suicide and disconnection and how men struggle to form and sustain friendships. And I think what they're seeking is perhaps something we all need, really, as humans, is some sense of community, some sense of belonging. Even if we're a hermit, a true hermit is quite rare, but most of us need other
Right.
people in some form. And that we've launched that recently. We've now got an online community which we started at the start of this year as an ongoing space for guys to just convene and share resources and ideas. And we started hosting a monthly call just for guys to come together. So that's probably one of the main things I'm seeing in our work with men.
And before, like, we'll put this at the end, but where would they find that? If they just get to this part of the episode, where would they go to find those free communities?
Yeah, so they can. Our website is leaderbrotherson.com,
Okay.
and you can find on there our free circles. It's just called Circles. You can also find on there Kinship, and Kinship is the name of our online community, which is just ongoing and has started recently and is kind of growing and growing.
Okay, great. I'm trying to practice putting these things in the middle of the episode just in case anybody's noticing. I'm starting to kind of try to integrate some of this so people, because you never know how far people listen. So I want to make sure we give the resource as we go along. I'm
Sure.
interested because I've talked to so many guests on this podcast that say the same thing. This, community, loneliness, and all that. Do you find, again, like I said before we started, it's like this is for my own edification, and I'm super happy people listen along. But do you find that men that have strong family community, like whether it's, I mean, I consider my marriage to be exemplary. We have tons of stuff that we can deal with all the time, but overall it gets better and happier all the time. And so I would love to have more friends, but I don't have like a deep sense of loneliness and those kind of things. And again, I'm not saying I'm better than anybody else. I'm just trying to understand what that big miss, like, is it because we're lacking in some of those areas, or it's like someone can be, happily married, have great kids, have a great job, but still sense this, huge point of loneliness and lack of community.
Yeah, I think the way I think about loneliness, it's not the quantity of relationships, it's the quality of connection. And so I think you can be in a long-standing marriage or family and be lonely.
Mm.
Uh, Equally, you can have very few friends and just have your family and be deeply fulfilled because the quality of those relationships is very good. It's very high. It allows you to feel that you're expressing yourself, that you're being yourself, and you're being seen and heard and felt. These basic
Hmm.
human needs. I'm also very happily married to a person I believe is my soulmate. We had a baby 8 months ago. I
Congrats.
absolutely thank you. Very, very happy with my family. And I am someone who doesn't need many friends. I'm fortunate to know lots of people, but my close friends is probably no more than 5 or 6 guys.
Hmm.
And because a couple of years ago, I left the UK and moved to Germany, to Berlin, I don't see those guys that often anymore. And what I have noticed is a drop in my level of feeling connected because those relationships are important to me. So now, we have to try and connect in different ways, phone calls and catching up on occasional trips. But everyone needs different things.
Hmm.
Uh, Connection or lack of is different for everyone. And some people, I think it's more about having it somewhere in your life, finding it somewhere in your life, and it feeling, it really giving you a sense of belonging that's kind of sustainable. So you can find it in work, for example, but will it always sustain? Will it always be there? And there's a lot of research about what happens to people when they retire, men in particular, because often when they retire, by the time they retire, they haven't cultivated friendships outside work or relationships outside work, and suddenly that drops off a cliff. And not just their connection, but their purpose, their meaning in
Hmm.
life drops off a cliff. And in Japan, they have this, they call it the salary man, the man who's dedicated to work, who at times works himself to death. This phenomenon of karoshi, where Japanese men work themselves to death. It's been known that when Japanese men get to the end of their career, and often they've stayed with the same company, they're so bereft of identity and purpose, they commit suicide.
Mm.
Now, that's kind of an extreme example because that's some rare cases in Japan, but it does happen. It's a known phenomenon. But I see variations of that in most of the developed world, in developed economies, that there is this real enmeshment with work that can never, I think, my personal perspective, can't really give you the level of connection and intimacy that a human being needs.
Yeah, we were talking about this the other day that we actually was at a trade show last week, and we're with one of my consulting clients. We're actually there at this trade show, and we were talking kind of as a group. I was the only non-full-time employee, but we were basically discussing, hey, if I get hit by a truck within a week, someone else is going to come and fill this role. Like the company just doesn't, is not a widower of me that just
Yeah.
spends the next 10 or 15 years kind of figuring out what they're going to do. No, you're just you're replaceable.
Mm,
And so like how do you I think so many men in particular wrap their entire identity around that. And I'm guilty of that. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I own multiple companies and have tons of different brands and projects and all that kind of stuff. And I'm guilty of saying, hey, what do you do? And I will
mm,
explain it. I am an entrepreneur, right? Like that becomes part of my identity. And so I actually have purposely, as I meet people, especially men, I will say, what do you do for work? Like trying to get them at least to think about, because I don't want them to define who they are by what they do to make money.
mm, yeah.
I made a huge error whenever I was younger in the corporate world, climbing the corporate ladder, highly successful. And oh, I forgot that I had a brand new baby at home and a young wife, right? And she
Mm,
was a stay-at-home mom. And it almost cost me my marriage and my family because I had so dedicated that. And I remember her saying, "We're the ones that are going to be here." And she was right. I've since
mm,
I left that company 25 years ago.
yeah.
But and it's so easy to sacrifice because you have that purpose and you feel like you're getting accolades. And in my case, like I didn't know, you've got an 8-month old. I assume that's your first child.
Mm,
And so if you're dealing with your first child, like I was, like, I don't know, I had weird, terrible upbringing, but like, I don't know how to handle a kid, a baby. I don't know what to do. And
mm,
so, but I was really good at what I did at my work. And so
yeah.
I chose to take the easy path on what was the most fulfilling for me. And I think a lot of men do that with their marriages, with their family, with their interpersonal relationships, because, and to your point, they get to the end of the road on that, and all the crap they should have spent the last 40 years building doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. 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 I mean, we all know the cliche, right? No one on their deathbed says, "I wish I'd spent more time in the office."
Right.
And there's so much in what you've just said, I think, about uh, gender roles and how we're socialized and the masculine idea of what a man should do as a provider and uh, uh, and to be clear, I don't think being a provider is a bad thing. I don't think that's a bad role that men should avoid taking up. It's about the
Mm-hmm.
extent to which we're taking up and how it fits with the rest of our life. And I've become a parent much later in life than most people. I'm 46,
Mm-hmm.
so later in life than most people. But I'm also really grateful for that because I've learned so much. And I'm at a stage of life where I work for myself, I work from home, I earn far less money than I used to, but I wouldn't change it for the world because I'm
Mm-hmm.
around all day and I get so much contact with my son and I see my wife all the time, and it's amazing. We often think back to, when we were both working for companies and we had to go to an office or a place of work. And I would have been leaving at, say 7:30 in the morning and coming home at 7, if, maybe later. And if I think about doing that now and the lack of contact I have with my son, it's unthinkable to me. It's
Mm-hmm.
unthinkable that I would do that. But I was also in that rat race. I used to work for large organizations. So it's a very, very pernicious kind of role or pressure or socialization on men to take up this role, and it can sustain you for quite a while, particularly
Mm-hmm.
if you're doing well and you're getting the promotions and you're getting the bigger office and you're getting lots of money, but it can't sustain you forever, and
Yeah,
it's costing you something. It's costing you
unfortunately,
something.
yeah, like yeah, unfortunately, it can probably sustain you for decades until it's like it's all great until it isn't, right?
Mm,
Like
yeah,
that's,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
My kids were
What's that?
home
What?
my kids were homeschooled. My wife was a stay-at-home mom. So we grew up together as a family. We could travel and we had a vacation home in Orlando, so we would actually go down there during the winter time and like, but this was like our life, right? And like you
Yeah.
said, I could have made more money in the corporate world, probably. I could have had more quote unquote, traditional success. But yeah, that only lasts for so long.
Mm, mm. Thoughts just occurred to me. You were talking earlier about when we were talking about sort of underlying desires and fantasies, and you described how happy you are with your family and your life and what you're doing, and and it was almost like you were wondering, well, I think I've got everything I want, so what's my underlying? But it could be that you're living them. right? You're
Mm,
like you're doing this podcast, you said, for your edification, right? You're
yeah.
you're 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 doing the thing you want to do. You've got multiple businesses that clearly gives you something that makes you
Hmm.
feel fulfilled. And it sounds like you've organized it around the other things that are important in your life. So there is perhaps you've integrated some of your desires and fantasies.
Yeah, I think so. I always, it's funny because like on one of my I think my Instagram profile, I actually say living my bucket list. So
Mm,
like I've actually made it a point, and there's this idea that you have this bucket list of things that you want to die or do
mm,
before you die. And I realized probably 10 or 15 years ago that I had done everything on my original list. And I keep doing that. I keep having to rewrite and add more things to my bucket list because I keep doing all the things on the list. And
mm,
and again, there's no humble brag or anything like this. Hopefully that's inspiring for men to take that. Back in 2008, we kind of made a family shift. Our kids were maybe fifth and sixth grade, and we made this shift to say yes to life. And we talk about taking the entrepreneurial approach to life. We pulled our kids out of school for 3.5 months. They were homeschooled after this, but before that, they had been in elementary school. I think they call primary school there in the
mm.
UK. But we pulled them out and we did a 34 state road trip around the United States, 12,000 miles over 100 days, 34 states. We saw the entire early American history and saw the whole, so I'm one of those guys that if you say, how many states have you been to? It's all of them. So I've actually been to every
Amazing.
state in the United States.
Mm,
But that began a series of decision making. My wife turned from a homemaker to welder, rally car racer, like building cars, doing trade shows, and all of these things because we decided we were going to continue to live that yes life. It's like, say,
mm.
in business, a lot of times they'll say, when the customer asks you a question, the answer is always yes, and then you just figure out a way to make it happen because that's
Yeah.
like good customer service. So we took that approach to our lives. And
Mm,
to your point earlier about friendships, I only have a handful of friends, but basically all of my close friends are all over the world. And so this would be the way that I interact with them, and by text
mm.
or WhatsApp or all of those things. So I'm able to maintain those relationships. But yeah, to answer your question, that is kind of what I try to do with my life.
Yeah, and well, that's such a beautiful example as well of doing that sort of travel, doing that's going on those experiences together. I mean, that's phenomenal. You're never going to regret that. I mean,
No.
it reminds me, um, my kind of pretty much my last permanent job was I was working for a small consulting firm, and we'd kind of trebled in size over 3 years, and it'd been an amazing journey to be part of that. But again, it was starting to feel corporate and confining to me, and it wasn't really what I wanted to do. So I asked for a sabbatical, and they didn't have a sabbatical policy, so they gave me a sabbatical because I think they knew I'd leave otherwise, and they gave me 3 months off. And I asked for it because I had this call to adventure, and I don't know where this call to adventure came from, but I had to pay attention to it. And I got this idea in my head of I'm going to cycle down the west coast of the US, and I didn't even own a bike. So I got this. They gave me permission for this sabbatical. I bought this bike, this touring bike, in March, and in May I set off with my then girlfriend at the time, and we cycled down the west coast of the States, and that took sort of 5 weeks. We sort of stayed in a few places and stayed in San Francisco for a bit. And I came back from that trip a different person.
Hmm.
And there is something about doing that sort of travel, something about just going for responding to a call to something, a desire. And I didn't fully abandon my life. I managed to sort of, make sure I had a job to come back to. I actually quit as soon as I got back. But
Yeah, they're like, damn it.
yeah, I was just like, I can't do this anymore. But there is something. Um, it's hard to describe the feeling of really responding to that call that is coming from the soul, and just saying, I've got to do something about this. And I did. And I didn't have that much money in the bank at the time. And I will never, ever regret that. I still think about that trip now.
How do we, I think all of us have that inside of us, right? Like, how do we all have that sense of of adventure and wanting to do those things. And it doesn't have to be a 3-month trip like you and I both took, which is ironic that it's 3 months-ish. How do, why do men not, and I assume I know the answer to this, but why don't men lean into that? Why don't, and what keeps men from actually stepping out and having that adventure? And then how can men build up to that? Not everybody wants to. I'm one of these things. I'm one of these guys that I'm in control of my own life and my own destiny, right? Like I'm not a big I can't guy, like, because
Mm.
if you want to do something, you can figure out a way to do that. That
Mm.
trip, even that trip around the United States, I think we spent at that time $4,000 or $5,000, which is, it is a lot of money. You know, that's not a low amount of money. I'm
Mm.
guessing your bike trip, the bike was one of the most expensive things on that, you know, and
Yeah.
food and hostels or low cost hotels or camping or whatever you did. But it's people, men in particular, kind of wear this weight, and I call it the have tos of life. Like you wear
Mm.
this weight of the have tos, and you forget that you are actually in control of the get to part of your life. Like
Mm.
just like that whole just do it thing is a little cliche, but at
Yeah.
some point, if you want to do these things, you can probably figure out a way to get past your fear and make it happen.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I see more and more men actually doing that, which is really encouraging. I had coffee with a friend here the other day, a German friend, and his baby's due in a couple of months, his first baby, and he's taking a full year off from work. He gets
Wow.
full paternity leave, and he's taking the full year, and he is delighted. He cannot wait to have this year off with his new baby and his wife. Um, and I have another friend who really sort of career focused guy, but he took the maximum paternity leave he could in the UK when his first son was born, and they went to Japan for 5 weeks
Mm.
with their little baby, and they just had the most amazing trip, like once in a lifetime trip. So I see more and more guys doing this, perhaps of a certain generation. What does it take, or how do we respond to that call? It really varies for every person, and I think travel is just one way of doing that. You know, for me, I often talk to my wife. You know, there's kind of I have these polarities. On the one hand, I'd love to just go and climb a mountain, and you know, I love mountains and going and doing adventure travel. On the other hand, I get really nourished by sitting in a room on my
Hmm.
own and reading a book as well. And that for me is a different form of nourishing and filling myself up. So it's finding ways to do that that are easy first steps, perhaps. And something I often recommend to clients is well, something my coach gave to me, and you know, has been passed on by many people, is this idea of the solo, spending
Hmm.
time just alone. And I did a vision quest recently where you spend 4 days, 4 nights alone, fasting, and my coach had done that many, many years ago. She recommended to me years ago, just do 24 hours alone, no distractions, no stimuli, no talking to anyone, no food for 24 hours. And I did it, and it was a really, really insightful and striking experience. And I tried to do something like that quite regularly. When I say this to clients, I sometimes say, let's make it as small as possible. Just do 1 hour.
Mm.
Find 1 hour in your schedule where you sit in a room. You don't have to meditate. You don't have to do anything at all other than be on your own without any distractions, and just see what happens. Just see what it feels like. See what comes up. And usually there's a look of fear comes over their face just in spending 1 hour
They
alone
start
without
looking
any.
for their phone. How do I sneak?
Yeah,
You know, how do, you know, that kind
exactly. Yeah, you know, where's my phone, notebook? Do I take a notebook? No, just an hour alone. So it's finding these micro ways of doing the things, again, responding to the fantasy. You know, if we dream of, oh, I want to go to the Caribbean and you know get a yacht or something, well, what's a tiny way you can do that? You know, and sometimes I watch a lot of adventure films because I can't go and do all the adventures I want, and I get a huge amount just from watching an adventure film. Um, it can really sort of give me it can fill me up for a bit in the
of.
absence of you know going to the Alps or the Rockies or wherever.
Yeah, and I think men a lot of times don't even know what that fantasy is. Like they may
Mm.
have like an inkling or they may borrow their own fantasy from, like you said, an adventure film or Bond film or book or
Mm,
something they see on social or whatever. But I think they doing those little micro escapes, and escape may be the wrong word, but doing those little micro things may be the way to begin to explore your own adventure, your own fantasy. Like what could this look like if I had more time? I had a conversation with a buddy of mine, um, actually a couple days ago, and he was talking about this 10-day trip he did. He went overlanding, and overlanding, if you're not familiar with this, basically you have a self-contained vehicle and you go
mm,
camping, but you drive to different locations. So we went to 3 or 4 states, and but he's like, I had, and this is America. So I had my pistol for protection. I had my Bible. I had a few books, and that was it. And I was in
mm,
areas where my cell phone didn't even work. He said, I used my cell phone for music, and that was it. And he said, I
mm,
cannot wait to get back and do that again. Right. And
mm,
so that's part of that, but that's 10 days, right? You're talking
mm,
about doing it for an hour. I use the sauna. I have a little sauna that I built in my house. And so I'll use that 30 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever, to be in the sauna to do that. I walk on the treadmill first thing in the morning, and that's part of that.
mm,
You
mm.
can do different things and then begin to explore and do longer times.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you're saying. Or whatever form you use, it's about creating a space to just be with yourself
Mm.
and seeing what emerges in that space. So and then going back to mythology, religion, somewhere in all religions is a practice of solitude.
Hmm.
Jesus went into the desert, and you can see variations of that in most major religions. Practice of pilgrimage or going and spending time on your own somewhere. And whatever form you take, it allows things to surface that are worth paying attention to. And I often find I meditate every morning, and I often find just images and thoughts and things will come. And sometimes they're the most surprising things. They're the things that I wasn't even aware I still remembered. And some of these things, it's like, why is that coming up now? Now that I've allowed space for it, why is it coming up? Or do I need to pay attention to it? And that can happen I go for a long run or cycling or something. The same thing can happen. It can happen in dreams as well. Dream
Hmm.
work I don't do dream work, but I know people who are really experienced practitioners. It's where deeper parts of yourself, your unconscious, can start to release some images and some of those desires, fantasies, other things that need to be surfaced, and they can be clues as to what you need to pay attention to.
Hmm.
It's rarely you need to go on a cycling trip or you need to go to, kind of Montana, but it is there's usually something that comes up is worth just being curious about, and that can give you the clues, as you're saying, to maybe I need to pay attention to this desire that I don't get to give space to.
Yeah, and I like the idea of giving space to it, like being able to allow yourself to do some more of those things that you want to do or get to do versus
Mm,
because I mean, for me personally, there's always a list of have tos. Like there's always going to be more work, there's always going to be more chores, there's always going to be things that I need to do around the house, and but to really, to have some sort of practice to be able to get alone and to
mm,
explore that, I think is great. I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to ask one kind of what do you feel, and you can be as, brief or long as you want on this. Where are we at in terms of men and masculinity? I know that in the US it probably looks a little bit different than it does in the UK and Germany. However, I think there's probably more similarities than differences. Because I think it's actually a great time to be a man, but it's also kind of a weird time to be a man, especially
mm,
someone that tends to lean more towards, like myself, right? Like I kind of, my wife and I are pretty gender role, what we, kind of more traditional gender roles as you would expect in America. And we're totally fine with that. Like
mm,
that's kind of, I'm a workout guy and I go build things and work on cars and shoot guns and all that,
mm,
American, probably American West culture, but and I don't judge other people if they don't do that, but that also is like, I'm an upper middle class white guy. Like I'm the enemy to society these days in some ways in American society. But I'm curious, like what you feel like where we are as men and masculinity and kind of how we lean into that, how we help other men to lean into whatever their own version of masculinity looks like. Because I think that's just
Mm.
a great thing to explore.
Yeah. A long answer would be too long, I think. So
Yeah.
I'll give a short answer, I think. I think there's a lot of confusion right now. There are commonalities, I think, between the US and UK and other sort of developed countries. Um, Confusion about what men's role should be. It's become very political,
Hmm.
and there's these kind of there seems to be an unnecessary war about gender and um, uh, in a kind of some of it I find counterproductive in this
Hmm.
drive for being more progressive, and I would describe myself as a fairly progressive person, but we're in danger of replacing one set of gender roles or norms and saying these are outdated and just simply providing a new set, and that's not healthy either. To
Mm.
say you now need to conform to this. And I think where I generally land, and it's hard to give a sort of single fixed answer on this, but where I generally land is kind of what you've described about yourself and your wife. Are both people or whoever comfortable with the roles they've taken up? Are they conscious and aware? It sounds like you're quite conscious and aware of the sort of person you are, and this is what I do. Are they happy with that? Because if they are, and they're not harming anyone else, then it doesn't matter. I have a friend here who had another friend who I had coffee with, and he described himself as patriarchal, and he was kind of saying, "Oh, it feels like society's telling me I shouldn't be like this." And when I asked him what he meant by patriarchal, he is someone who he does a lot of stuff with his hands. He fixes stuff. He loves cars. He takes care of things. He really takes responsibility for things. He organizes things. He's kind of just really sort of um, organizing, arranging, fixing in that way that might be considered patriarchal. And he was actually in one of our men's groups, and when he shared that in one of our men's groups, someone said to him, "Well, that's not patriarchal. That's someone who takes responsibility,
Mm.
and you should be proud about that." And it was a really useful framing for him, reframing for him. So I think I guess where I land, the short answer I can give is there is confusion. I think it's about coming back to what we were talking about earlier. Find out who you are and really are, and kind of work with that rather than sort of trying to fit into some external role or what the world is telling you you must be.
Yeah, I tend to take a fairly libertarian approach to the whole thing. Like it's like, I don't need to like this is my life. This is what I believe about myself. This is how my wife and I and our family kind of do our thing. And like I don't need you to do that. In order for me to be happy and to feel fulfilled, I don't really care what you do, right? Like
Mm,
that's up to you to make those decisions. And I think if, honestly, I think if to your point, it becomes politicized and it's like we're making a big deal out of stuff that doesn't need to be a big deal. And I think if we all
mm,
just mind our own business a little bit more, we
mm,
we would probably all be happier and healthier. And I love that you shared that about his thought because I wouldn't call myself, I would actually probably refer to myself in the same way, patriarchal.
mm,
But to that person's point that, corrected him, like I'm one that like I'll push my wife out. If we're gonna get mugged, she stands behind me, not the other way
mm,
around, right? Like
mm.
I'm the protector and provider and not and dude, she's a badass. Like there's 100% she's a boxer. So technically I should probably put her in front of me if there's no weapons involved. But so I don't discount her ability to do that, but that I feel like that's my role. To
Mm,
be that protector and provider and I am the guy that gets things. I fix things. I also
mm.
break things, but I fix things. And so those are, so I think that's okay. And I think the point is that like whatever role that you have, continue to explore that, but not in lieu of, don't say, well, this is what society tells me that I can or can't be. Like try
Mm,
to figure out who you are as a person and as a man that fits your own, where you want to be.
yeah. Well, it's interesting to read some feminist authors and feminist thinkers on this, and firstly, there's no single view, and secondly, I found it really striking how much they share this sort of view. And so, to take one very contemporary example, Esther Perel talks a lot about masculinity. She's been talking a lot about masculinity recently. And she said something like, "We've had 50 years of feminism that's allowed women to re-examine their role. And, that's still a work in progress. And, we're tearing down structures and barriers that prevent women from living in their fullest expression." But she said, we haven't given men the same opportunity. We haven't given men the chance to reframe what their role is and kind of rethink what their role is and who they want to be, because they're still confined to a particular role or a particular idea of what it means to be a man. So that's the work, I think, that's where we are now, to come back to your question. That's the work that we need to do with men.
I think that's a great place to stop. I think that's as Micro says, and I say this on all the podcasts, but I think that's a great place to land the plane, so to speak. I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think, unfortunately, now the feminist movement is going to struggle because of some of the weird stuff that's going on, and we're a people that struggles to figure out who we are individually. And yeah, let's just continue to work and have conversations and do that, quote unquote deep work, and go out, spend an hour, go out, spend 24 hours, go out, spend 10 days or 3 months, whatever that looks like for you. Really start to have that time together. Hey, this is amazing. I really appreciate. I know we didn't really know which direction we were going, and then an hour later, I think we had some great discussion. How do people find you again? Let's go ahead and put that out there.
Yeah, so my coaching practice is Selfish Leader, so selfishleader.com. The work I do with men and masculinity is leaderbrotherson.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn. It's the only social media I use, really. Jindy Mann. I don't think there's many of us on LinkedIn. You can find me on there. I've got a couple of newsletters. They're on the websites. You can sign up there.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, you're probably a healthier person by just being on LinkedIn. Mentally, especially, and staying off the other socials, for sure. And you can find us, speaking of socials, we're on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, and I'm on there personally as well. Maxed Out Man, you can search for that, or maxedoutman.com. And I hope you'll listen to other podcasts. Make sure you rate and review if you can. And hey, Jindy, I appreciate this. This has been awesome. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
You too, Kevin. Really enjoyed this. Thank you.
If you're looking to really maximize your life and become the man you were made to be, head over to maxedoutman.com and get your journey started today.